Professor Jane Ridley is Professor of Modern History at the University of Buckingham, where she teaches an MA in biography. Her books include biographies of Lutyens, King Edward VII, as well as the life of Queen Victoria in the Penguin Monarchs series. She's currently working on a biography of King George V. When the Duke of Wellington died, Queen Victoria wrote, "He was the greatest man this country has ever produced, and the most devoted and loyal subject, and the staunchest supporter the Crown ever had." It's pretty hard to beat an accolade like that. This lecture explores the connections and the relationship between the Iron Duke and the Queen, who herself possessed a will of iron, of course. And I think at that point in time, I'm going to hand over to our distinguished speaker tonight. So, Professor Ridley.
Can you hear me? Thank you very much, Sir Christopher, for that very kind introduction. When I was asked to give a lecture about Queen Victoria and the Duke of Wellington, it seemed to me that there wasn't perhaps an awful lot in common between these two people. Queen Victoria, born in 1819, was 50 years younger than the Duke of Wellington, who'd been born in 1769. And really all that they seemed to have in common to me was giving their names to strange places in the Antipodes, such as the state of Victoria and Wellington in New Zealand, and also to railway stations. I came down today from, well, not quite Wellington, but Waterloo, and there is, of course, Victoria Station. And they also shared a biographer in the shape of Elizabeth Longford, who wrote lives both first of Victoria and then of Wellington. But when I came to look at the subject a bit more, it seemed to me that actually there is quite a lot that really hasn't been much brought out about the relationship between these two characters, both at the personal level, but also, I think, in terms of the evolution of the British state. But it is certainly true that at the beginning of Queen Victoria's reign in 1837, when she came to the throne, she was very unsympathetic to Wellington and to Wellington's Tory politics. She was the little Whig queen. And of course, she was very much in the pocket of the Whig Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne. Not quite so much in the pocket as you might think if you looked at the film of the young Victoria, but all the same, she was very much under Melbourne's spell. And of course, Wellington was at the opposite end of the political spectrum. Her image, too, after her marriage to Prince Albert in 1840, Queen Victoria's image was, and I'm quoting Bagehot, Victorian, a perfect middle-class wife. There's a Victorian joke about somebody who goes to a play, a Victorian who goes to a play, a performance of Oedipus Rex, which was also a sort of royal play, Rex being a king. And of course, the story of that is that Oedipus murders his father and then unwittingly marries his mother, blinds himself, and then kills his mother. And the playgoer emerged from the theatre and remarked, how different, how very different from the home life of our own dear Queen. In fact, of course, they hadn't been watching ITV on Sunday nights. And there are actually some parallels between the story of Queen Victoria and her son Bertie and the Oedipus story. But the fact is that Queen Victoria's public image of being a sort of docile, domestic, bourgeois wife was, in fact, very much at odds with the reality. And Queen Victoria, in many ways, was both at home and also in public, was an exceptionally warlike figure, very bluntly spoken, and very confrontational. And as monarch, she was, of course, head of the army. And she, although as a woman it was probably unlikely that she would ever actually lead her troops into battle, Nevertheless, she embraced her position as head of the army with enthusiasm. Queen Victoria never forgot to remind people that she was a soldier's daughter. Her father, Edward, Duke of Kent, had had a rather brief military career. In fact, it wasn't a terribly glorious military career, the Duke of Kent's military career, because he was, strangely, because he was a sort of fairly gentle human being. But as a soldier, he was a martinet, he was a disciplinarian. And he flogged his troops so much that he was stationed on Gibraltar, looking after a garrison of troops on Gibraltar during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. And he was so brutal to his troops that they almost mutinied, and he had to be removed from the command. So it wasn't exactly the most glorious of military careers of Queen Victoria's father, but nevertheless, she was the daughter of a soldier. And one of the things that she insisted very shortly after becoming queen in 1837, she insisted on reviewing her troops. Not only that, but she insisted on riding a horse, which was thought, remember 1837, this is a time when women, it's thought to be faintly indecent for any woman to be on horseback, even if she's side saddle, totally indecent if she's astride. But it was thought that this was very inappropriate. Now, with this first review of her troops, Queen Victoria is accompanied by the Duke of Wellington as the sort of hero of the age. And Wellington protested quite vigorously against Queen Victoria's plan to ride a horse at this event. And so here we can see a print with Queen Victoria in the middle, side saddle, and it's very hard to see, isn't it? But Queen Victoria is flanked by the Duke of Wellington on one side and Lord Hill and the King of the Belgians behind her. Lord Hill, the head of the army. Wellington said that this was very unsuitable, but the Queen thought it was wonderful. And she wrote, "I felt for the first time like a man, as if I could fight myself at the head of my troops." And she wore on that event something called the Windsor Uniform, and this is the actual sort of dress that she wore, which had been designed by George IV, and it was a uniform with red collar and cuffs and navy blue. Increasingly, after this initial sort of frost between Wellington and Queen Victoria, we find relations between them improving. Wellington might not always have been terribly successful at keeping political parties together, but he did have, according to Elizabeth Longford, his biographer, he did have a vocation for managing royals. And increasingly, he came into favour with the Queen. And so we can see the Queen. You probably can't see that, it's tiny, I'm sorry. But this is a sketch for a painting by Landseer, who was one of Queen Victoria's favourite painters, done in 1839. And here is the Queen reviewing her troops with the Duke of Wellington on the right wearing a red coat, and the Queen you can see riding side saddle and wearing her Windsor uniform. The Duke is increasingly coming into royal favour. In 1841, 2 years later, Queen Victoria has her first child. Her first child is born, Vicky. Victoria, Princess Royal and later Empress of Germany. And this is the christening of the Princess Royal in 1841. Wellington was not actually asked to be a godfather, but he was asked to stand proxy for one of the missing godfathers, the Duke of Coburg, Albert's father, I think. And you can see him very prominently positioned in that print, wearing his military uniform. It looks rather as though they're going to eat the baby. And also the Queen became increasingly in her sort of work life, came increasingly in contact with the Duke. In 1841, of course, Peel became Prime Minister, and Wellington was his staunch ally and leader of the Tory party in the House of Lords. Wellington also played a very important part at this time in overcoming Queen Victoria's suspicions of Robert Peel. Victoria had a very bad experience with Peel at the time of the bedchamber crisis in 1837, when Queen Victoria actually blocked Peel from becoming Prime Minister by refusing to change her ladies at court and sack the Whig ladies and appoint Tories. And so there was a pretty bad background to the relationship between Victoria and Robert Peel. Wellington, however, because he gets on so well by now with the monarch, is able to smooth this over and act as a kind of sort of mediator between the Queen and her roughly spoken Prime Minister with his Lancashire accent. So Wellington is leader of the Lords, and then in 1842 he insists on adding to this a new and very big job, which is being Commander-in-Chief of the Army. So he, although at this time he's already over 70, he has two major, well, leader of the Lords was less of a responsibility because usually only about 12 people there and mainly asleep, but being Commander-in-Chief of the Army really was a serious job. And again, this is commemorated in another painting commissioned by Queen Victoria, which this is a painting by Francis Grant, Victorian painter. And here we see Queen Victoria reviewing in the front, in the foreground, riding a very energetic horse. I think there's probably quite a lot of artist's license in that. Wearing a general's, I don't know how you pronounce this word, aiguillette. Anyway, a field marshal's aiguillette, that sort of gold ribbon that's sort of blowing in the breeze. And you can see behind her Windsor Castle and also the Duke of Wellington on the right with the Royal Horse Guards and the Coldstream Guards. And these kind of paintings, the Lancia painting that we saw before and the Francis Grant painting, where the only kind of identifiable figures are the Queen and the Duke of Wellington. The point of these paintings is to stress the closeness of the relationship between the Queen and the Duke. And at this time, but I wasn't able to find enough detail about this, but maybe somebody could fill me in afterwards. The Queen, I understand, asked herself to stay, much to the horror of the Duke of Wellington, at Strathfield Say. But I don't know how that stay actually went, but I would like to hear about that. Anyway, in 1845, 1846, Peel's government is toppling over the repeal of the Corn Laws. The Conservatives are rebelling against Robert Peel's proposal for free trade. The original Brexiteers, in the shape of the protectionists in the Conservative Party, led by Disraeli, who's sort of antecedent of Boris in this scenario, are splitting the party in order to keep agricultural protection. And it's quite clear that Peel's days as Prime Minister are numbered. Now, Victoria is miserable at this, but she knows that she can't hang on to Peel if he's defeated in the House of Commons. He will have to go. But she clings to this hope that she might be able to hang on to Wellington, who is her favourite person at this time. And so Queen Victoria writes to the Duke of Wellington in December 1845 and asks him to stay on and keep his job as Commander-in-Chief and head of the army. She appeals to the Duke, who has so often proved loyalty and attachment to her person, in asking him to give her this assistance. Now, I think this is actually really rather important. because what is happening here is that we're getting a distinction between the sort of political office and non-political office, and it's being, because the Duke is staying on which he does as Commander-in-Chief after 1845, indeed until his death. This basically means that the army is clearly identified as being non-political and non-partisan and outside party politics. And it's interesting, historically, that this relationship evolves as a result, essentially, of the personal affection that Queen Victoria has for the Duke of Wellington, and probably also the affection that Wellington had for the Queen, and the loyalty that he had for the Queen. I suspect he was a terrific sort of sentimental royalist. This, I think, is, it's not just a matter of the Queen getting on with the Duke of Wellington. This is a matter of a sort of major constitutional point, that the army should not be mixed up with party politics. And the Duke of Wellington was quite right to stay on. I mean, I suspect he couldn't say no, because I think it was his absolutely favourite job. Now, the next sort of interchange between the Queen and the Duke happens very shortly after the fall of Peel's government, with the creation of the Wellington Statue. Now, I'm ashamed to say that I didn't actually know about the Wellington Statue until I started reading around this lecture. This is a very flattering picture of the Wellington Statue. Basically, what there is the Duke of Wellington's house, which was Apsley House, and Number 1 London, as it was called. And outside it was this rather wonderful classical arch by Decimus Burton. And in 1846, a gigantic statue of the Duke of Wellington by a sculptor called Matthew Coates Wyatt was commissioned and placed on top of the arch. Now, when you look at it there, it actually looks quite sort of all right. But the Wellington statue was an enormous, gigantic piece of work. It weighed 60 tons of iron, the Iron Duke, 60 tons. And when the Duke of Wellington woke up in the morning at Apsley House, he would look out at this vast statue looking into his bedroom window of himself. And I think it's actually very interesting why there was this statue on such an enormous scale was commissioned. But I think it has something to do with Nelson and Nelson's column and Trafalgar Square, which is going on at the same time. I think that there's a sense in the 1840s that, the revolutionary Napoleonic Wars, which in 1815 left Britain feeling exhausted, broke and in debt. By the 1840s, it's very plain that those wars have actually established Britain as the richest and most powerful country in the world as a result of those wars and as a result of those two men, the Duke of Wellington and Nelson. And so there is a sort of cult of the Duke of Wellington and Nelson, and the way in which people express this enormous popularity of these heroes is just to build gigantic memorials of them. Hence this enormous and apparently not, I haven't seen it, but apparently not, probably it's wonderful, but it didn't get a very good press at the time. There was a huge amount of criticism in the newspapers, and the government in 1846-7 thought quite seriously that they ought to respond to this criticism and take the statue down. Now, the poor Duke of Wellington got very hurt by this criticism and very unhappy. And he wrote to the Queen saying, if this statue is removed, this will imply that the Queen, who of course lived just round the corner at Buckingham Palace, that the Queen doesn't support her Duke and that she no longer extends her confidence to him. And it's quite interesting. Queen Victoria, for her part, didn't think the statue was a thing of great beauty. She thought perhaps there could have been another statue. But she thought it was really important not to upset the Duke of Wellington. So, in 1847, Queen Victoria wrote to the government and said that the Queen has been informed that the Duke of Wellington is apprehensive that the removal of his statue from the arch to another pedestal might be construed as a mark of displeasure on her part. As a result of that letter, the statue remained where it was. This enormous urn construction remained sitting on this arch. Interestingly, it's not actually removed until 1881. It was taken down in 1881 by the equivalent of the London County Council for reasons of traffic circulation. It was so heavy that they couldn't actually move it. So they cut it up into tiny pieces and took it to Aldershot, where it was reassembled, put together again, and where it still is today, I think in rather an inconspicuous place, but it can be seen at Aldershot. And there has been some rather interesting historical work about the history of Wyatt's Wellington and the Hyde Park controversy, which explores the Wellington statue as an indicator of Wellington's public reputation and the mythology of celebrity. But I suspect it's probably just as well for the Duke of Wellington's reputation today, in today's climate of politically correct iconoclasm, that his statue is safely tucked away from public view. Or we might get people doing what they're doing, asking for everything to come down. I mean, they're asking for Nelson's column to come down, aren't they? So we have this general picture of a growing sort of rather friendly and close relationship between Queen Victoria and Prince Albert and the Duke of Wellington. In April 1850, the Duke of Wellington came to stay at Windsor with Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. By this time, the Duke is 81. And he is just beginning to think that perhaps he ought to retire. I think that's very good that he went on till 81. And so he begins talking with Albert about what you might describe as his succession planning. Who should succeed him as Commander-in-Chief? And Wellington's idea is very interesting because Wellington suggests to Albert that really the best person to succeed him would be Albert himself. Albert should become Commander-in-Chief of the British Army. This would be extremely appropriate in Wellington's view. Now, Albert's response to this is lukewarm right from the start. He wrote in his diary that he was not very eager for the plan. And his Victorian biographer, Theodore Martin, who wrote 6 wonderful volumes of the Prince Consort's life, each one less read than the next, Martin observed that looking at Albert's diary, there were far more entries in this period, far more entries about sewage than about being Commander-in-Chief, because as I'm sure you know, Albert was a great pioneer of sewage works, refining sewage and recycling. Anyway, that to him was more interesting. But these conversations about the position of the Commander-in-Chief and the Prince Consort continued all for the next few days. And various more discussions took place between Wellington and Prince Albert. And Prince Albert took very careful notes of what Wellington said. And he writes that the Duke was most anxious on account of constitutional reasons that I, Albert, should assume the command, as with the daily growth of the democratic power, the executive government got weaker and weaker. It was of the utmost importance to the throne and constitution that the command of the army should remain in the hands of the sovereign and not fall into those of the House of Commons. Now, that is the Duke of Wellington speaking. And of course, the Duke of Wellington's ideas about politics they weren't exactly liberal. But Wellington is basically saying that it would be very dangerous to allow control of the army to fall to the House of Commons, and that it should remain in the hands of the monarch. Albert's reply to this is to say, well, okay, but what if there's a revolution, as there had been in 1848? If there's a revolution, would it be advisable that the responsibility of shedding the blood of the people should fall on the Queen's consort? I mean, wouldn't it make Prince Albert very unpopular if he is actually, commanding the army and telling it to shoot on revolutionary demonstrations? And Wellington didn't think that would matter very much, and he said that actually the sovereign might find it his duty to place himself at the head of his troops. Now, this is what basically Wellington was stating, a position which might have been true at the beginning of the 19th century, but which was no longer tenable in the middle of the 19th century, when Britain had a major reform bill in 1832, increasing the strength of the popular element in the constitution, and meaning that the monarch really couldn't just choose who was going to be prime minister, had to choose a prime minister who could command a majority in parliament. And equally, one of the things that followed from that was that the monarch was, just as it's lost political power, so it should lose military power. So Wellington is really refusing to accept the lessons of the Reform Bill of 1832. In a way that's understandable, because 1832 was a short time ago in 1848. Nobody really knew how the Constitution had changed. But it had changed, and Albert understood that. And in his refusing to take that job, of course we have, one factor is that Albert had no military experience at all. Even so, in his refusing to take that job as Commander-in-Chief, again, a really important constitutional point is being made, and that is that the monarch is no longer in control of the army, a momentous decision about the relationship between the sovereign and the army. And that is only happens because Wellington forces the issue by offering the job to Albert. Meanwhile, in 1850, Queen Victoria gives birth to her 7th child and 3rd son, who is born on the 1st of May, 1850. Now, the 1st of May was actually the birthday of the Duke of Wellington in 1769. So, as a sort of tribute to the Duke of Wellington, this prince is called Arthur. And the Duke of Wellington is appointed his godfather. This might sound ordinary enough, but actually to be all the godfathers of all the other royal princes and princesses, daughters and sons of Victoria and Albert, they were all royal. Even though they might be rather, by British standards, rather small royals, they were still royal. So this was, to be a non-royal godparent was a great honour. And this was commemorated a year after the birth of Prince Arthur in this painting by Winterhalter, which was made in 1851. It's a painting that you're probably very familiar with, but it's essentially, Winterhalter was Queen Victoria's favourite court artist at the time, and the design for this painting was taken from Renaissance art. Here we have sort of, the idea is this is the sort of 3 wise men, the adoration of the Magi. Here is the Duke sort of paying homage to the Queen and her baby son. 1851, remember, is the year of the Great Exhibition. And if you look on the left of the picture of the painting, you can see the Great Exhibition in Hyde Park, that sort of structure on the left. And Queen Victoria in the painting is wearing Queen Adelaide's, that was the wife of King William IV's diadem, that amazing headdress she's wearing, and also the dress which she wore for the opening of the Great Exhibition in 1851. It was Albert, of course, who suggested the form of the painting and the idea that it should echo various famous Renaissance paintings that Albert knew of. And so one of the changes to reality that Albert made concerned the present which the Duke of Wellington is giving the young Prince Arthur. In this picture, Wellington is holding a jewel casket, which Albert thought would be appropriate. But in fact, what the Duke actually gave the baby was a gold cup and toys. And the jewel casket gave rise to all sorts of sort of misunderstandings, because when Prince Arthur grew up, he became he'd seen that painting so often, I suppose, he became obsessed that there was some lovely present for him inside this jewel casket. And he kept asking to see it, and of course it didn't exist. The Duke of Wellington did not enjoy sitting for this painting. It meant he had to, leave London and go out to Windsor. And the sittings often took 3 hours a day, and he very much resented the wasted time. However, I think it is actually one of Winterhalter's better pictures. I think it's a good painting. Now, the Duke of Wellington in this painting is 82, and the next year, in 1852, he died very suddenly on the 14th of September. He was at Walmer Castle, which was one of his official residences, and when he was there, he used to sleep in a metal camp bed, which was only 27 inches wide. He must have been quite thin, the Duke of Wellington. Really not very comfortable. Perhaps he always slept in a camp bed, probably did. Anyway, while he was sleeping in the camp bed at Walmer Castle, he began to suffer from a heart attack, and he died within a very short time, very, very suddenly. And it was when the Duke died that the Queen gave that eulogy that Sir Christopher read at the beginning, that he was the greatest man in capital letters this country has ever produced, and the most devoted and loyal subject, and the staunchest supporter of the Crown ever had. He was to us as true, kind a friend, and a most valuable advisor. Victoria and Albert were really stunned when they got the news of the Duke's death. He'd become a kind of sort of grandfather figure to them. And they were on an expedition at Balmoral, and they were a very long way away from the events at Walmer Castle. Now, Victoria and Albert decided that the Duke should be given a state funeral, just as Nelson had been given a state funeral many years before. But there was one slight inconvenience, and that was that this was September, and the whole of the political world, and most importantly, the Queen and Prince Albert, were on their extended summer vacations, scattered all over the country. And so, from Balmoral, Victoria and Albert wrote that there would be a state funeral, but it must be postponed until Parliament met in November. It's quite a long time to wait for a sort of, they didn't have an awful lot of concern about what the Duke of Wellington's family might have thought. He had to be embalmed, obviously, to stop him being, to keep the body preserved. And there was no sort of proper funeral or anything for almost 2 months. Well, more than 2 months. Queen Victoria was also rather inconvenient because she wrote to the Duke's family asking them to send her a lock of hair. She loved sort of, mementos of dead people. And she wanted a lock of the Duke's hair, so the Duke's valet duly cut it from the Duke's head in his coffin, and the coffin was instantly soldered down. That was the last time the Duke of Wellington was ever seen by his valet cutting a lock of hair for Queen Victoria, who made it into a brooch. At last, after 2 months, on the 18th of November 1852, the funeral took place. And there was this procession, massive procession, through the streets of London. This is, I think, from the start at Apsley House. You can see the arch that we were talking about on the right, and you can see, I get a sense of the huge crowds that flocked to the Duke of Wellington's funeral. I think one could probably do a whole and very fascinating lecture on the Duke of Wellington's funeral. It was this state funeral and massive public mourning, particularly when people saw his boots reversed on his horse and all these very sort of tear-inducing gestures. But there was one thing that again caught the attention of the less reverent Victorian public, and that was the funeral car. Now, if you look at this picture, you can see this enormous sort of structure with the coffin on top. I'm sorry, it's probably rather small. But that was the funeral car of the Duke of Wellington, which was really a most extraordinary piece of work. There is a story that it was designed by Prince Albert, but that was really designed to discredit Prince Albert. But Prince Albert certainly took an active interest in the design of the funeral car. And he commissioned a certain amount of academic debate about the funeral car. Prince Albert didn't do it, but he took an interest in the designs. He looked at the designs and he checked them. He commissioned 2 people from the South Kensington School of Art, which Prince Albert had set up very recently, Henry Cole and Richard Redgrave. And they were commissioned to design the funeral car. But there was also, we think, a German architect and designer involved in the design of this car, who went by the name of Semper. And the German architect Semper had based the design on the funeral car of Alexander the Great, so all sorts of Grecian, classical Greek precedents for it. It was made of solid bronze, it weighed 18 tons, and it kept sinking on the procession from Apsley House to St Paul's, where the Duke was buried. And of course, immediately, there was an awful lot of ribble stuff in Punch about the Duke of Wellington sinking into the mud. And it did seem a slightly unfair thing to inflict on the poor old Duke of Wellington, this rather ostentatious funeral car. I think, just to conclude, I think that Queen Victoria's relationship with the Duke of Wellington was very important to her own reign as Queen, and also to the nature of constitutional monarchy in Britain. And if you compare countries which had been enlightened despotisms in the 18th century, where the aristocracy had been sort of swept aside, the monarchy had been strengthened, and the army as well, you get a very different picture. In Germany, or in Prussia, Victoria's son-in-law, Fritz, who was the Crown Prince of Prussia, led his troops into battle in 1866 and 1870 in the wars first between Prussia and Austria, and then Prussia and France. That would never have happened in England. In Russia, as late as 1915, during the First World War, the Tsar Nicholas II himself assumed the head of the army, the head of the army, and led his troops with disastrous results, as we know, with the Russian Revolution. This was really the major wrong decision, because, of course, the army was disastrously defeated and Nicholas got the blame. So in Britain, you've got this much more distant relationship. George V never thought that he ought to go out to Flanders in the First World War and lead the troops in the trenches. It was. I mean, he went out to visit them, but it was unthinkable that he should assume command. As a female sovereign, as I said, Victoria could not lead the troops, but she maintained very close relations with the army. The commander-in-chief to whom she was closest after the Duke of Wellington was her cousin, the Duke of Cambridge, who kept her very closely informed of army developments. And Victoria loved to play the role of being a warrior queen, particularly during the Crimean War, 1854 to 56, when she said, "I regret exceedingly not to be a man, to be able to fight in the war. My heart bleeds for the many fallen, but I consider there is no finer death for a man than on the battlefield." And she played an active part during the Crimean War. She got herself this very smart military jacket made by Savile Row tailors during the Crimean, and she wore it when she reviewed troops in the 1850s. Here she is at Aldershot with Albert on her right. She, during the Crimean, also did far more, I think, than monarchs, George III had done during the Napoleonic Wars. He hadn't attempted to do this. She visited sick soldiers in hospital, which became a sort of a royal tradition. And she continued throughout her life to review troops. Even after Albert's death in 1861, when Queen Victoria, withdrew from public life, she still went, as here she is in a coach, in 1868, every year to review her troops. She signed every single officer's commission by hand. She insisted on doing that, and there were thousands and thousands of commissions that she had to sign. The fact was that Queen Victoria respected the soldiers and the army more than any other profession. That on the one hand, but on the other hand, as I've said, there was no question that the monarchy should be military. When Victoria's eldest son, Bertie, Prince of Wales, asked to be allowed to have a military career, it was blocked absolutely by Victoria and Albert. They were quite happy for the sort of younger sons. Alfred, their second son, had a career in the Navy, and Arthur, who we were speaking about, had a career in the army. But it was out of the question that we should have a military monarchy. So, paradoxically, I'd suggest that the person who was primarily responsible for that was the Duke of Wellington, by engaging Victoria and Albert in these really important issues. Thank you very much. Can I go to sit down?
Well, thank you very much. We've got time for a few questions. Now, to help facilitate it, we do have some roving microphones. So if you could just wait until a microphone reaches you, and then we can ask the question. So if you put your hand up if you'd like to ask a question, we can get a microphone to you. Thank you.
In the recent ITV series, when I think it was her uncle was trying to get Victoria deposed, Wellington seemed to be on the side of that, putting Victoria aside as a monarch. And I just wondered, was there any basis of truth in this at all?
Sorry, I didn't quite get what you were saying. Wellington was trying to do what?
He was part of the group that were trying to put Queen Victoria aside as the monarch in favour of her uncle. I think it was the Duke of Cumberland, the one that became King of Hanover, but not England.
What date are we here?
80. Ooh, help.
I mean, before she's Queen. Or
no, I think it was after she was queen.
Well, I think that's complete rubbish.
Yeah, well, yes, I'm delighted to hear you say so.
But no, I feel very embarrassed because I haven't been, I saw some of the first series, and I'm afraid I couldn't sort of, it made me so annoyed that I couldn't sort of, I thought, I haven't watched any of the latest series, so I'm out of date. I ought to look at it. But I'm sorry I can't be more helpful. But it is complete rubbish. The Duke of Cumberland tried to do that. And equally Wellington.
Another question?
There's one here.
Well, yes.
You made the point about Wellington not mixing the military and the political. Isn't the point actually the other way round, that Wellington was in the cabinet and actually agreed to become commander-in-chief? He was actually mixing the two, not separating them.
Absolutely.
And if you compare that of 1828, when he became PM, he actually resigned as commander-in-chief.
No,
he was the one creating the bad precedent.
No, that's quite right. But then in 1845 he holds on to it, even though he's going to be out of politics. So it's not as straightforward as I'm saying, but it's not. I mean, it becomes then after Wellington, it's no longer remotely political. I mean, the Duke of Cambridge is not a political appointment.
Any final questions? Just down there.
Hello, going back to the early years of Victoria's, when she first became queen, and the question of her marriage was raised, was the Duke of Wellington not terribly anti-German and pro one of her English cousins? I can't remember, but he was blind or something. I can't remember who it was.
Hanover.
Was it Cumberland?
Yeah.
It was Cumberland. Why did he put him forward as a...
Well, is this Victoria or is this different?
Well, it's Victoria.
I mean, the film.
But it was... No.
Good, okay.
Actually, it's Elizabeth Lockwood's book.
No, I think the thinking behind that is that, there was a lot of suspicion that basically there was a Saxe-Coburg takeover, that people didn't want... Queen Victoria's mother, the Duke of Kent, was, of course, Prince Albert's aunt, the Duchess of Kent. People didn't want, and she was unpopular enough, the idea that Queen Victoria should marry her first cousin, and that also this all should be sort of set up by King Leopold of Belgium, who was Queen Victoria's uncle, was understandably caused a lot of sort of hostility. So the alternative, promoted by the Hanoverians, that's to say by George IV and particularly William the Fourth, was to say, no, why don't we marry her off to the Duke of Cumberland, because this would have the dynastic advantage of bringing Hanover back under the British Crown. I mean, the union of Hanover and England, which had been the case since 1714, and also it would, more importantly, perhaps, this would stymie the plan to basically have a Saxe-Coburg takeover. So I didn't know what Wellington's position was on that, but it certainly made sense dynastically. But the only trouble was that Queen Victoria really was not remotely attracted to the young sort of Cumberland prince.
Well, thank you very much. That falls to me now to sort of formally thank you. I think there's a few key points tonight. First of all, I have to say it was a truly fascinating lecture, and I think the juxtapositioning of the monarchy and the army in particular, I think in the relationship here, I found really very enlightening. It's also very clear to me that in a time of false truths, we clearly need Professor Ridley to sort out the filming of the Victoria series as we go forward. So thank you very much. It really has been a fascinating talk, and I think we'd just like to thank you in the traditional way. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And as we have a tradition, I have a small gift also for our distinguished speaker, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Now, we also have another tradition at the Wellington Lecture every year, and that is the honour of having the Duke actually present the Wellington Prize. And I'll now hand over to His Grace to actually do this. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'd also like to thank Professor Ridley for an extremely interesting lecture. She asked during it, how did the visit to Stratfield-Say go? She's quite right that the Duke was horrified at the prospect. Most people in his position were looking forward to a visit by the sovereign to their house. He was the very opposite. He dreaded it. He and his housekeeper agreed that whereas Stratfield-Say House was a comfortable house for his family and friends, it certainly wasn't grand enough or big enough to receive the sovereign. But as he said to the housekeeper, what cannot be avoided must be borne. And so she came in January 1845. He did subsequently enlarge the house because he realized it really wasn't quite big enough, and should there ever be a future visit. However, it did apparently go very well, the visit, and he did write to one of his correspondents saying that the visit seems to have gone very well. So I think that was a great success. Another point I might comment on, I think Queen Victoria wasn't the only person who wanted a lock of Wellington's hair. There were lots of people who wanted locks of Wellington's hair. I think by the end, practically all his hair must have been cut off. Because certainly I have, and indeed we now have the lock of hair given to Queen Victoria, which was returned some years later to the family. Anyway, that's enough of that, but I very much enjoyed the lecture, and thank you very, very much, and I wouldn't have missed it for anything. Now, my duty at this moment is to present the annual Wellington Prize for a piece of work about the history of the late 18th or 19th century. And this year, a very interesting piece of work has been chosen by the university with my total agreement and approval. And it's about Lord Clive, in particularly his second period in India. I was particularly interested because he left India in 1767, exactly 30 years before Arthur Wellesley arrived in India, and shortly to be followed by two of his brothers. So there were three Wellesley brothers in India for a long period, from late 1797 right through to 1805. And so what Clive achieved in India was of great interest to me, and I've read this, not all of it, but I've read much of it with great, great interest, and I congratulate the lady who wrote it, and it is therefore my great pleasure to present Catherine Fernandez with this year's Wellington Prize. And very importantly, is the original working. Well done. Well done.
Thank you very much, Your Grace. Well, Professor Ridley, thank you very much once again for a fantastic and very memorable lecture. And thank you all for joining us this evening. Thank you.